You mentioned the subtitle of Bowie's book is a Kantian perspective,
That's
and
correct.
that indicates there are some heavy-duty ethics theoretical issues at stake here. And the usual foil to Kant in the contemporary literature is John Stuart Mill, and you do appeal to John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism as guidance for how to think about these issues of partiality and impartiality. How does Mill come to the rescue, so to speak, or at least how does, that's too flip, how does Mill provide guidance on these thorny issues?
Well, the way Mill provides guidance here is through his distinction between fundamental and secondary moral principles. This isn't really so much a utilitarian versus Kantian distinction. In fact, you can see the two-level structure of morality that Mill talks about in Kantian deontology itself. What I'm saying is that the way out of the confusion is to recognize the distinction between fundamental moral principles, which are principles of justification, versus secondary moral principles, which are action-guiding principles. I'm saying fundamental moral principles, that's what moral theory is. But applied ethics, of which business ethics is a part, is mostly about identifying action-guiding principles that we can follow. And so I think the mistake that lies at the root of Bowie's argument is that when he says that if the impartiality requirement applies anywhere, it applies in the ethics of business practice, he's taking a fundamental moral principle, a principle of justification, and treating it as if it's a secondary moral principle, a principle of action guidance.
So that then is different from saying that the requirements or duties of impartiality are a small subset of normal business practice, whereas the rules of thumb of partiality are the majority?
Well, I think the best way to say it is this, is that the impartiality requirement in ethics is a requirement to reason from an impartial perspective.
Okay.
It's not a requirement to act impartially. In other words, we can have impartially derived reasons to act partially, and we do so very often in business as well as in other walks of life.
All right, so the other part of the argument then is a secondary backup, that if you look at the business facts on the ground, partiality is the dominant mode of business practice, and impartiality cases are a subset, secondary cases. That's a supporting argument.
That's it, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, basically because business is a web of agency relations.
Okay. Now, I wanted to make a connection to one of the major debates that's characterized the business ethics literature for the last generation or so, and that's the stockholder versus stakeholder debate. And I wanted to ask whether your distinction between the partiality positions and the impartiality tracks onto that, in the following sense, that stakeholder theory will often say the way business managers should think about proper action in a business context is to identify all of the stakeholders, right, in a business. There are employees, there are customers, there are investors, there's society at large, and so forth, and that one, to be moral, should be impartial with respect to the interests of all of the different stakeholders. And the stockholder position, by contrast, says there are a lot of stakeholders, but nonetheless it's morally fine for business managers to be partial primarily to the stockholders' interests, and that the others are derivative secondary interests. So is the debate between you and Bowie, say in this case here, also the stockholder-stakeholder debate in another form?
Well, it is. That is, the way I would put it is that the stockholder-stakeholder debate is a particular instantiation of the general thing that I'm talking about in the paper, which is that the stakeholder theory basically is an attempt to take a practice, in this case the management of enterprises, which is governed at law and by custom in partialist terms, that is, managers of firms are to act as fiduciaries for the stockholders, and turn it into an impartialist one. You know, one of the ways I put it in the paper is that ethical business practice is less like judging and more like lawyering. Right? A judge is supposed to be impartial. A lawyer is supposed to zealously represent the interests of his client. So really, the stockholder argument is an attempt to fundamentally change business practice. It doesn't give an ethics of business. It is a new ethics for business. In other words, we want business people to do something else. That's what the stakeholder theorists are saying.
All right, so they, in your judgment, have an idealized conception of what business practice should be.
Correct.
Your argument is that methodologically we should be starting empirically and realistically about how business does operate and work within that framework. to figure out the moral principles.
Well, yes, I think only that is applied ethics.
I see.
What's being done under the guise of stakeholder theory is moral philosophy under a different, or excuse me, I would say normative political philosophy under a different name. Mm-hmm. These people want to design new economic institutions, and that's fine as normative political philosophy, but as an attempt to tell business people who work within a given set of institutions what it is to act ethically within those institutions, I think it's a failure.
Okay. If we kick things upstairs to normative ethical theory or normative political philosophy, another debate over the principles there is the debate between egoist and altruist ethical principles. And one form of altruism, if we take it very strongly, says that one should be selfless, right, in moral considerations. And that means not allowing one's own personal interests to guide anything that one does. Instead, one should selflessly see oneself as a servant of the needs of other people, the needs of society at large. And that strikes me as pushing in the direction of a strong impartiality. And the egoist position, by contrast, says it's fine to be partial to one's own interests, and that we're all mutually seeking our own self-interests in a market economy, right, or whatever. So is there then a tracking between this impartiality-partiality debate, as you see it in the business ethics literature, to the long-standing debate over egoism versus altruism? I do note this just in passing that Norman Bowie also wrote a strongly critical argument attacking ethical egoism. So there, I'm wondering if you see a connection there as well.
Well, I think there's clearly a connection. I mean, the particularly stringent form of altruism that you just laid out would preclude anyone appointing an agent to act on their behalf. Because if you can't act on your own behalf, how could you appoint an agent to act on your behalf? Right? And similarly, it would be hard to be an agent in those circumstances, because to be an agent would be to be partial to some as opposed to others, whereas the essence of altruism is to serve all. Right? So an altruistic ethic can't underwrite things like agency relations or fiduciary duties.
All right, so then, once again, if one is prior to doing business ethics committed to a strongly altruistic ethic, that would then mean your business ethics has to attempt to be transformative, right? Not take business practice as is, but rather to try to change it into a radically different kind of moral practice.
Yeah, I think it's constrained to do that.
Okay, and so do you suspect that's what Bowie is doing?
Well, I suspect that's what Bowie is doing. I suspect that is what the mainstream of the field is doing and has been doing since its conception.
All right, fair enough. All right, fascinating material. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Stephen.